Bueno, vamos a empezar y
Okay, let's begin while we have others with us. Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to this webinar number 26, if I'm not wrong, presented by the CCA since the end of March. Let me say some words in English. This is a seminar that will be entirely given in Spanish, but we do have interpretation service.
Webinar that the CCA will have presented since the end of March. This one is obviously on a very timely event on Venezuela. We have made interpretation available. At the bottom of the screen, you will see the interpretation button. Please avail yourself of that if you would like. We have a wonderful interpreter, Gloria Mejia, who will be interpreting from Spanish to English. So with that, I will change back to Spanish. Bueno, gracias por la paciencia.
Okay, thank you for your patience. And let's begin now. I'd like to give you some items. If you'd like to ask a question to the panelists, you can press the button on the bottom. It's called Q&A. And there you can write down your question. Please make them brief and concise and not long paragraphs. But so we do beg you to make them short questions. This is the 26th webinar we've held from the Canadian Council for the Americas since the end of March. This should be the last one of this year, but we will begin the next one on January 12th with an annual event that's quite popular among our stakeholders. And it's a forecast, economic and political, of Latin America. For the next year, we'll have at least 8 panelists. And as always, it's going to be free. So if you're interested in this, you can find more information about this at ccacanada.com. Okay, that will be held January 12th. And we do have other events that we'll be announcing quite soon. So before we begin with the panelists, I would like to say that we're very sorry about the recent drowning of the Venezuelans during this weekend. And it's another indication of the human cost of that crisis experienced in Venezuela, such a high cost for everyone there. And with that said, the idea that we have for today's webinar is to talk about the circumstances in Venezuela today, the elections that were held December 16th. And we'd like to talk with different voices from the opposition in Venezuela to give an account of where is the opposition today and the different opinions that are within the opposition. And today, we're really glad of having wonderful panelists, people that's really involved in this topic regarding Venezuela. We have Ricardo Rojas. He's a former candidate for the National Assembly. We have Vanessa Neumann, president and founder of Asymmetrica, and former representative for the president, Juan Guaidó, in Venezuela, of course, in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Gaby Arellano, a congresswoman from the National Assembly of Venezuela. And Vladimir Villegas, a journalist and host of Vladimir a la Carta of Globovision. And I understand Vladimir also has a radio program. So he's a mega media star, as we say. Okay. I'd like to begin asking some basic questions. First, what does the government of Maduro count with when it comes to citizen support? So let's begin with those that are today in Venezuela. Ricardo, would you like to begin? What's the level of support that Maduro really has today in Venezuela, in your viewpoint? Okay, well, thank you for your invitation. And I'd like to say hello to my fellow panelists. And I hope that this conversation is good to have good conclusions about my country. Firstly, we have to consider that the government, although the numbers show in the results of the voting system that the government has been losing support, it still has support, and it's basically from different areas. That support today has been built authoritatively with nepotism, with the giving people crumbs, giving people food coupons, food in general, and doing favors to the administration officials. So that's the way that the national government really has been able to have its support. We also have to keep in mind that there's another support from a social base that does believe in what Hugo Chavez created. And that base still has, of course, contradictions, political contradictions. It began with a patriotic party when a part of it left it, but still, there's an important base. Also, there's another social base that supports Maduro, separate from whatever it's doing. And so the size of the support of Maduro is quite big. And you can see that the opposition of Maduro was very weak in this last campaign. And this has led to give the government more force. And I'd like to end by saying that there's a military support that backs the control over the institutions and the governments. And that army, those militaries, is part of every setting of the public administration. There's also a paramilitary support that really imposes control on neighborhoods. So it's a unique party. And in these elections, it was alone to finally control every setting in the public order. Thank you, Ricardo. Vladimir, what do you think? I understand that the support for Chavez is higher, if I understand well, than Maduro's government. How do you see that? Well, firstly, I'd like to say hello to all the panelists, Vanessa, Gaby, Ricardo. It's great to see you. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share with you this time. Let me say several things. Most of the surveys have clearly said that the government is rejected by more than 80% of the population. So Chavism has a social support, yes, but it's at about 4 million people. But let's talk about Chavez and Maduro. Everything has to do with the official Chavism. There's one that's dissident, but it's quite weak still. The government is strong, because of something that's fundamental, because of the division seen in the opposition. If this government would face only one opposition with a defined leadership, with a single policy, without ulterior plans, or with a policy that's coherent to rescue the democracy here, I'm sure that Maduro would not have any chances to win. For me, that's fundamental. And that's what today we have in Venezuela. The government is weakened because of the economic situation of the country. The government now has found some resources and says that that the sanctions imposed on the government, the economic sanctions, is why the government is doing badly. And as Ricardo said, there's also some lobbying and another factor that we cannot put aside, and it's the militaries. So far, the government has been clearly backed by the national army, by the militaries, and even the opposition has called them cowards and says that they're corrupt, that they're going to pay for what they've done. But at the end, they try to seduce them. So it's like a schizophrenia that we're all feeling towards the military. And the bottom line, the government really has been supported because the opposition has underestimated the government, this government. And this, of course, has shown the mistakes made, meaning that we can have a political change quickly in Venezuela, that with foreign interventions, we can make changes in Venezuela, to have more conflicts. I mean, this really could not take place first because it wasn't clear. It was the plan was full of mistakes and frictions and divisions within the opposition. And that's great for the government of Maduro. Economically, the government has made a big chunk of the population to depend on it. And that, of course, leads to social control, for repression. We have tuned repression. So there are many elements, many items that have supported the government. So what's ahead? We don't know, but that's my first viewpoint to your question. That's something we'll talk about before 3. But thank you. Let's look at the strategy of the opposition, of course. We'll address the militaries as well. So thank you for your words, Vladimir. Gaby, what's the real support of Maduro today for you? Gaby, are you on mute? Okay, hello to everyone. Today, Maduro is there because of the weapons, the mafia, and social control. That keeps him in office. If we look at the numbers, 10, 15, 16% of popularity. But what keeps him there? If we look towards the past, the little that popularity he had in 2013 is really worse today. And this has to do with the opposition. Everybody has really lost. The support that the opposition had 5 years ago was much more than today. But really today, the plan, the strategy of the regime to tune their control, the repression, the censorship, the fear, because really what they produce is fear, is what keeps it there. And it was something that with the development of the National Assembly with Guaidó, that while you have weapons and the military with you, you stay in office. Thank you, Gaby. Vanessa, thank you for your patience. Do you agree more or less with that Maduro's support is low? And obviously, the next question you can answer right away. What's the the level of support enjoyed by Juan Guaidó and Leopoldo Lopez for the opposition, formed by them at least. What do you think? Well, as you know, I resigned officially December 1st to my position. My participation in these events is always to try to find a solution for Venezuela, despite I resigned and going back to the private sector for personal and professional reasons. For me, really, it's an honor to be with this panel. Thank you for the invitation, Ken, and for those that are with us. And, and for sharing this space with me. I feel honored that you said yes, that you would share this event with me. And I see it as something very positive for the Venezuela that we should build. There are no secrets here. There are several people here that have different opinions that are quite significant, but how we want a different Venezuela is in interest. The last time I went to Caracas was in 2017 during the protest. I was there May, June 2017. I was there. I spoke with a lot of people from Maduro, from the opposition, journalists, civil groups, to truly understand what's happening. And then I went back to the States where I lived and I began my activism against the blood bonds, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that my viewpoint is more that I don't have the privilege of being in Venezuela now. My viewpoint is different, but I think it's very difficult to estimate exactly. I mean, I say that Maduro is there because of clientelism, the militaries, and there's other topics there, the mafia and social control. And what's happened with Maduro is that he's created a power scheme that's very well articulated. It's like a power network in which you control client clientelism with militaries and mafia, which have control over territories, and that means social control. So it's hard to know because every group in every territory has forced to be resilient, but not to finish the jigsaw puzzle. This if if once if one falls, nothing happens. And until that entire network doesn't face Maduro with the militaries and those groups that want a new Venezuela, it's our obligation to try to create the basis. But until we can't do that, we won't see a change or a transition to a democratic Venezuela. Given this, answering your second question, Ken, I've always defended that under Juan Guaidó, we have the constitutionality of projects, meaning we follow the Constitution, the National Assembly, and really that has given us international support along with the terrible crimes of the Maduro administration. So diplomatically, it's been a different setting. Why? Because of the constitutionality, which is like in a parenthesis, at least internationally. And frankly, they're just distracted and saying, look, this of Venezuela is too complicated. Hey, you had elections already. Try to fix your own problems. And that's what the international community has done. And on the other hand, in 2 years, Maduro is still there. And that's an international problem and a domestic problem. So I believe that that popularity of Guaido and of Lopez has been dropping and dropping and dropping because nobody sees results from them. But my last point is Guaido isn't there because of his popularity. It's not that he won in the elections. He's the result. He's there because of the result of the Constitution. So to say that Guaido's popularity I think we're mistaken here. I think that what we should say about Guaidó, he's there because of the Constitution. And the other politicians, it's because of popularity. And I stop here, and then we can talk about new ideas for a stronger opposition or a newer. So, Vanessa, this is a question for you and for everybody else. Besides the difficulty to organize an opposition under the difficult conditions and the repression in Venezuela, do you truly believe, and we'll begin with you, Vanessa, that the opposition really has represented the Guaidó project? No. Okay. Please expand. Why hasn't it been extensive enough socially and representatively? Yes, thank you. And again, it really is an honor to be part of this diverse panel. And I'm saying this with my blue eyes. I frankly don't think that the opposition has been representative enough. And I think that I think that matchism has been a problem. I think Gaby can say that I'm right. The inclusion of women has been zero. And I mean, it cannot only be white men in the positions of power. Something that I do want to say, and it is a criticism, I think the opposition has given away the pie, has been looking at the pie, but the pie doesn't exist. I mean, everybody's taking a piece of the pie, but the pie doesn't exist. And I feel that the political party of Guaidó really has been making a mistake here. It's the G4 in Caracas is very different to what's seen overseas. It doesn't combine well. And I believe that the role of women in Venezuela, in Venezuela, we're housewives, we suffered during the humanitarian crisis. But I think that Venezuelans, number one, should be representing the people say, I want to represent you. There, we see two things. One is the racial and social economic position. For me, Venezuela, it's like a rainbow. It's a country of immigrants. Everybody should be represented. Also show people, all the gays, the LGBT, everybody should be represented. And we also, there's another failure, and it's that we should create like a structure of what would be a government. You cannot ask the people of Venezuela, nor the international community, and even less the military, to leap into a vacuum. I mean, we need a structure that's parallel so you can have a government plan. So every time that Maduro has something, you have a strong response, something well-based. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Ricardo, and then Gaby. Oh, do you agree with Vanessa's criticisms? And how can you make a coalition of the opposition that could include people like Vladimir and Ricardo? Gaby, let me ask you that first, because they're both in the opposition, and they say it out loud. Do you agree, Gaby, with what Vanessa says? Or do you think that that's impossible? Firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. The popularity and the support of Maduro is less every day, but the popularity that the democratic sector had in Venezuela from 2015 to today is less. And I include myself. I was elected as well in 2015. Everybody, it's among Venezuela. Every year you make a balance of what happened. And I look at not the last year, but the last 5 years, constitutional period, with a lot of people supporting the opposition, where also there were a voting system that wasn't 100% guaranteed and transparent. Yes, but the people of Venezuela went out, voted, participating, made a change. But there was a mistake. Those that made the decisions, and I want to say this, the triumph we had in 2015 placed us in this festivity mood for 6 months in a row. And the first ones that were surprised by the support we had from the Venezuelan people was us. And when we realized that the regime had changed everything, because in December 2015, there was a change. The people went out and voted enormously. It participated strongly, with determination, with a clear promise of the National Assembly to make the political change in Venezuela. But today, the goal has not been met. First, because the parliament didn't work as a parliament. Second, because we had the work of 14 million people, not only those that voted, but everybody. Because there's something in 2015 that we saw in Venezuela, is that the assembly did represent everyone, because Chavism was there. It existed, exists, and will exist. And not to understand the premise that it still exists and will exist, and that it's in power. And it's not that Maduro in January 6, 2016 would leave. For me, not having a coalition and a strategic unity, because our unity was only with the election. But by December 2015, when we assumed the new period, we broke the pact. There was one pact, that the one that had the most votes would lead the National Assembly. And we began to break it ourselves, those that were part of the National Assembly. And we didn't have a parliament, and we had diversity, respect, tolerance. And personally, I feel really guilty because I just stayed quiet. I saw things and I didn't say anything, believing in a premise that some leaders had a plan and that the plan would get results. And I was in that, I wasn't in the first line. I was fourth or fifth, I was an observer. But the main role of the Congress was not given, and that was the biggest mistake. We call it a G4. I don't know if it's 4, 5, or 6, or 7 men. I don't want to talk about individuals, but it's obvious today that when you do not have strategic unity and going from the perfect assembly to a political strategy, to be able to have the people, because the people voted for us, for all of us, just for one thing, to have a political change in which the life of Venezuelans was more dignified, was improved. And this is something that I've said within the parliament. I was part of the party of Leopoldo Lopez, and I resigned this year because there's no debate. Dissidence is not respected. It's not that you're not loyal. I mean, if you're not an accomplice, you cannot be there. Because when you see something that's wrong, you have to remain quiet. Because if you say something, if you ask for an explanation, if you ask questions, you're separated, you're left aside. So the big challenge for this year that will begin, or this new period, because I hope that there's a change, is that there really is an internal debate to discuss the factors that we need against the dictatorship, and to really debate and to leave aside the Twitter and the media and really sit down and say, look, Vladimir, what you said isn't good, and I say you're not right because of A, B, or C. So again, Most of the opposition leaders in Venezuela spend months and weeks and months without even using the WhatsApp, without chatting. And there's where the weakness that we have of most of the country. I think that nobody, that Maduro and Chavez, nor Guaidó really represents. I mean, there's a gap, an enormous gap. If you tell me who leads them, I think it's, I mean, since 2018, I'm in exile in Bogota, and I've had to move there. If I stay in Venezuela, I would be in prison because I've been facing the regime. I'm 37 years old. I've faced Chavez and Maduro, but today the balance and the few things that I do agree with what Vladimir said is that the mistakes of the opposition favor Maduro and his office in Miraflores. The mistakes of the opposition have favored Maduro because after 2015, he established a plan. And I think that the Cubans gave him the script. And we've seen how in every sector where decisions are made, the number one line is led by people that follow him. So we've seen this. I'm not pinpointing, but so the big challenge of the democracy of Venezuela is to respect human rights, to respect that this is, and we have to debate and build a consensus. I've heard these days Leopoldo and Guaidó talk about giving guarantees to those that are with Maduro, but they don't talk with Luis Ortega. They don't talk with was in Chavismo. They don't talk with the opposition leaders either. So beyond the discourse, which is a big challenge, is that the democratic political class of Venezuela has to go beyond it just a legal discussion and connect with the feelings of the Venezuelan people. Because today it's disconnected. We don't have Maduro nor Guaidó or the big leaders, political leaders with the people of Venezuela. There's a gap, no block. It's consolidated firmly because of diversity in what you can call the Chavism and Madurism and the democratic sector. There's a huge difference. So it's, and that's, remember, this is why I don't know who is Ricardo, but we shouldn't fear each other because we think differently and because others say things that I don't agree with. I'm not going to chase that person. I think that we have to listen to each other, debate with bases and foundations, and build the country. And that's something. I'm part of the responsibility. We have to stop being looking at things on a short-term basis. The exile has really taught me that this is an entire process. Chavez got to power because of a long process. Nothing gets done from one day to another politically. And why don't we look at the refugees seriously in Venezuela? Because the people from the opposition will go to Washington, Europe, and Colombia and say, no, we have 5 months to settle this. So overseas, people will say, why bother? In 5 months, everything will be okay. But now, even if we're here right now, if Maduro says, I resign, the millions of Venezuelans will not return to the country. It's a process. So creating false expectations, creating false pretenses, false dreams. And today it makes me talk frustrated I mean, we told the country we had a plan, but we never did. That would include, that would respect the people. And this is something we have to build. I'm in exile every day. I want to go back to see my family, to see my people. And there's nothing harder than to be in exile. Because those that say it's easy, it's because they don't know how difficult it really is. You can have, so I think the big challenge of the political people in Venezuela is to assume our mistakes, our failures, and to say, okay, we haven't done things well, and we cannot underestimate Maduro anymore. And we can't say that he's dumb. No. He got there in 2013, and look at where he is, and he's going to stay longer. So if we understand who we're facing, from here on, perhaps we can have different results. I'm sorry if I went on and on. Thank you so much, Gaby. This is a discussion precisely to listen to everybody's viewpoint. It's great that you don't know each other, and that's why we're here. So Ricardo, I can imagine you heard interesting things already, right?
Esas cosas antes de Vanessa.
And what Vanessa said and Gaby, what do you think about their comments? First, I would like to greet Gaby, and I want to congratulate her because there's a level of sincerity in her words that is related to a balance she's made of all the effort that she was part of, she's made. I think, Gaby, I agree with her in some things that she's said, especially the posture of the opposition, which had a great majority in the National Assembly and had in its hand great mobilizations and social power. And as Gaby said, there was a party for those first 6 months and nothing was done. Let's hope that we don't have a hangover forever. We've got to make better decisions from here on. With regards to what the opposition has done so far, I agree with what Gaby has said. Right now, I would add, however, that the opposition did what it did, acting with the social base on a very utilitarian basis. It wasn't extensive. They thought that they had success in their hands, but down the road it started to fade away, and they abandoned the people. They had a good capability of internal mobilization, which was a signal of the struggle, but also they took a political path that was called that way, the karma of the opposition. That political path became a dead end. And besides proposing free elections and the transition government, we started to see struggles that failed. Violence took over the mobilizations and confrontations, using weapons. Also, we had interventions. We have to keep that in mind, because if there's a matter that we have to agree on in the future, is that we bet that Venezuela will be settled in Venezuela, and we don't need any interventions whatsoever from Trump or Biden or Putin or the Chinese. That's something important we have to keep in mind. So that path is important to evaluate because we even considered that we could have an interim president, which ends on January 5th. And that was defeated, of course. And we also have to question the leadership. Remember that PSU doesn't have an absolute renovation of leaders. If we look at the composition of the assembly, and we see the same leaders, like in the opposition. We find there people that have stayed there that were based on their egos. It was a vertical leadership which led, which gave way to the G4. There really was a lot of personalism there and personal interests among these four leaders or G4 leaders. So the work is, you can see today that the numbers have dropped enormously in the opposition. I would say 60% of the population doesn't follow Maduro or Guaidó. So, and that's important to keep in mind. So for future events, if we want to build ties with the people, we have to avoid betting politically on the same people. And to say that those that do not agree with us are terrible people, we cannot continue saying that. If you provide solutions, you're with the right or with the imperialists. So those levels of making policies have hurt, of course, the political foundation of the country. And something else with what Vanessa said, the Constitution, I think that what Guaidó did was unconstitutional. I think that Guaidó intoxicated the democratic foundation because it was a violent leadership in the Assembly National, and it's still against the national government. So the constitutional foundation is intoxicated now, and that's led the people to feel uncomfortable and not believe the democratic system. So there's a wave against politics we have to overcome. Thank you, Ricardo. Vladimir, you have a lot of things to talk about, surely. You can discuss whatever you want, but I'd like to add something else. If everybody, all four panelists are in the big vacuum, what do we need to create an extensive coalition, much stronger than what we have before? Again, thank you for your invitation, Ken. Okay, I know Gaby. We've talked. I've interviewed her. With Vanessa, I've never been with her. But Ricardo, I know him for many years at the university. And he, as well as I, went through the Chavez movement. And it's no sin. But what's important is what we can do from here on. Let's begin with what Ricardo said. I've said it many times in interviews and the shows. The big victim of all this has been the Constitution of Venezuela. It's been left aside by the government for a long time, also by Chavez. In 2007, I left the government because of that. When we saw the constitutional reform, I said, no, I've got to leave because I saw I couldn't continue. Others left before in 2001, others joined 2002, others did it in 2015, others even last year, and others like those of the Communist Party and the APR have had a critical posture in the past 3 months, almost against Maduro. So we've all had our moments and our own vision of what's happening in Venezuela for me.
Vladimir, yo creo que ya. ¿Nos escuchas, Vladimir?
Vladimir, can you hear us?
Sí. Pues esperamos.
Okay.
Intentamos conectar con Vladimir.
Let's try to reconnect with him.
Marta, a ver si
Martha, can you give us a hand with that? Meanwhile, oh, here you are. Vladimir, carry on, please. The internet problems of Venezuela. It happens, it happens. I said that the Constitution has been the biggest victim in this process because the government, not even the opposition, doesn't really use the Constitution. So we have to begin with that. And I have observations like Ricardo on the mantra and how that policy was executed. Also, the government really went against and put the opposition outside of the electoral track. And they did it because they placed dynamite on the path with the G4. They put fire on the dynamite and everything exploded. So now in the election of CV, it's a problem. A lot of people stop believing in politics. Why? Because they don't see in elections any change, and because they do not trust the opposition either. Here we had an internal war in the opposition. For instance, what Gaby says today, I share most of what she said, unlike what she says about me, but that's good in democracy. But look, having a different division became a sin. Within the opposition, you couldn't discuss the mantra at all. Why couldn't that be discussed? Why couldn't we discuss the strategy and the regional elections? So a lot of people questioned the electoral path, and now they're saying, okay, where is the political coherence of a movement that should be an alternative of the power? And what Gaby says, it's clear, there is no clear plan. And we depend on international factors to force the changes. For instance, what happened with the humanitarian aid in Cucuta? We cannot confuse the humanitarian aid or something that gives way to a rebellion or to promote popular protests. These are two very different things. If you mix humanitarian aid, which is complicated, with a political order, you neutralize everything. So I disagree there. With regards to the opposition, there are different viewpoints, and it's good. And the international community cannot just listen to one viewpoint, because there are different ways of appreciating things. For a long time, we said that path would only create frustrations, and we see them today. The path of the transition was another frustration. What happened on April 30th was another frustration that contributed to demobilize people. So all these adventures for immediate goals made people lose the capacity to gather. In fact, we have to look at how today the leadership of Guaidó is so weak. I don't think it's an interim government. I think it's a fantasy. I'm sorry. But it's a fantasy. Not even those that are part of the parties that focus on him or follow him call him president. I mean, it's that bad. So, Ken, when you invited me, you said, we're going to talk about how to look at the breaking point, at that first step that we have to, that we want. Gaby wants to change Venezuela differently. Vanessa also wants to change Venezuela. And surely we'll have differences on the country that we want. Yes, how we want Venezuela. What's the best model for Venezuela? So, Vladimir, what should be those first steps to have a consultation? If it's not from the overseas, I understand what you're saying, and Ricardo has said that as well. This isn't something that can come from afar. So what would be that first step? How could Venezuelans take control in that vacuum to create that extensive and more inclusive coalition? I mean, what can be done? First, we must recover the decision-making process of the internal political parties of Venezuela. We cannot put a third party in the bed of a couple. And what Vanessa said, we have to acknowledge ourselves. We have different viewpoints, yes, but we have a common goal. And this is what the opposition of Chile could move on with all their internal oppositions. And they did everything made in Chile. We have to do this exactly with Venezuela. We cannot say that the gentlemen work with the government, they're terrible, and that we start to segmentize people. And of course, that divides. The first factor we have to understand that we cannot do things alone to have any changes in Venezuela. And second, we have to rescue the electoral path of Venezuela. The opposition undermined the success we reached in 2015. It really undermined the success of 2015 and thought that Maduro would leave in 6 months. And Maduro reacted. It became more authoritarian and it became stronger. It stayed. So first, to close, we have to rebuild the electoral route, return to the people that they have to believe in the government. There's nothing more that gives way to mobilization, social mobilization, if people gather in the elections. I mean, an authoritarian government never gives anything away. In elections, things are different. We have to nationalize the conflict, as I said before, and we have to force a negotiation. To think that this can be solved violently is terrible. I would stop here. Remember, I was with Chavez. So, what do you think, Ricardo? Thank you, Vladimir. So, Vanessa, if I understand well, all four panelists are saying that today, under the circumstances that we see today, it would be a mistake in the world if the international community would only use Mr. Guaidó and Leopoldo Lopez, and that those two gentlemen would be the only opposition vehicles, that they should also expand the conversations, etc. What do you think? Yes, right, evidently. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this webinar. That's my opinion. Yes, absolutely. And I remember I was in there, and there are two things that I would like to answer this with. There, I agree with some things and disagree on some things of what Vladimir said. Okay, the relationship of the international government and the political factors of Venezuela are oh, frustrating. And basically, we have to mobilize from within, but the world has to listen to different voices. So you say, I would I would find out through the British government what we were doing in Venezuela, and it was terrible. Look, you're sitting you're sitting in Norway, and I would say, really? You're sitting in a negotiation in Barbados. Why am I finding out through my partners, my diplomatic partners, of what's happening in Venezuela? It's terrible. The idea was don't ask, we'll let you know. And sure, as a diplomat, you cannot have your own opinion. As a diplomat, you have to represent your bosses and create ties. So the ties were well prepared. Everybody says that, but always representing without questioning is difficult because that's not part of my personality. I question everything and I argue everything is wrong. So when it comes to the negotiation to Vladimir, I say yes and no. On the one hand, absolutely, you need a negotiation of how Maduro can get on a plane. I think Venezuela has to say if they want, the people of Venezuela has got to say if they want to punish him now or look. I've had threats. Uh, I I have friends that have been tortured and killed in Venezuela. So I understand the rage. I really am a hardliner. I have a background in security. I've got my medals, right? But given that, think that you have to focus on what's the goal. And this is something that you learn in diplomacy. If the idea is that Maduro and his pals can get on an airplane and go live in southern France, perfect. And then give way to the transition. That negotiation can take place, but sitting at a table again in Barbados with the official opposition of G4 that does not represent the entire people of Venezuela, and to have a negotiation face to face is a waste of time and money. We need two things to happen. One, which is obviously because of my security background, to get the support of militaries, exile, that, and not to make them be violent, but to make them to be treated with respect and to try to find among them a leadership in the new Venezuela and see if they can help you create the network uh, of social control and territorial control. And you've got to have a clear strategy to use strategies to undermine the militaries. Otherwise, there's no change. That's my position I have as a hardliner. On the other hand, the negotiation should be not only with G4s in Barbados, with Rodriguez, which love me personally, yes, Delcy especially, but not only that, but to create the negotiation has to be more extensive with those that support Maduro, which is Russia, China, and Iran. Because why is he still there? Because they don't want to let him go, because he provides a service. He's a puppet that provides them a service. So we have to have that negotiation, and also with our partners and our allies. It can not only be the US government. I think that Biden's government will present an opportunity, not because it's going to be easy and pro-Cuba. Look, if the British or I think if the British or the American want to be softer, good. If we have Cubans that leave Venezuela, great. If other countries can have a relation with them, fine. We need Venezuela to have a dignified life again. That would give a great opportunity. The multilateralism of Biden also provides an opportunity. The international group of Lima should also coordinate better to speak stronger and more multilateral, so that they have to face on the one hand side the repression that's in Venezuela. One, second, to create an opposition that is not only that is taken by the G4, that's more inclusive. We hope that today we can have a seed for that. And three, a negotiation with the purpose of taking Maduro and his gang out. And it's a negotiation also with the international partners that keep him in power. Because yes, Venezuela has its own problems. Venezuelans have to face it, yes. But to say that only Venezuelans are going to, the Venezuelan people will arrange this is naive. Because remember, there are flows of illegal financial supports given to Maduro. That's something we have to stop. Yes, Vanessa, I understand what you're saying. But at the same time, if the Venezuelans or the opposition cannot organize itself, there's no transition or anything, right? You're right. So we have to we have to understand with step one and then step two. If you fall tomorrow, if Maduro falls, leaves tomorrow and his gang, what will happen in Venezuela without an extensive coalition there to lead the country? It would be a difficult transition. So if you allow me, let's go back and discuss that. The first things, the first steps that we need. Gaby, Ricardo, tell me. I think that we're about to end, but I don't want to end before asking this. Which could be the specific steps that we could take, one, two, or three, or specific matters that we need to address to create the foundation or a convergence, or to begin to have a convergence between that vacuum, within that vacuum of the opposition? Gaby? Well, Ken, after listening to all the panelists, I'm going to say three things. First, I do not share that we have to have a negotiation to avoid violence. Violence is already in Venezuela. We have to nationalize the conflict because the external players have made things worse. I really believe that Venezuelans, but using Cubans and Russians and Iranians in there, has made things worse. So if we take a step back and look at the full picture, I agree with what Ken says. We have to take one step at a time. So what we can do ahead is what we see here, that we see that Vladimir and Vanessa, we do not say, no, Vladimir didn't look at me nice. That's something that we have to change in the opposition, because I agree with you, Ken. Until we don't have a democratic unity and a strategy as such, or a strategic unity, I insist that the problem is not in 2019. The problem is in 2016. Our main mistake, again, in which I am included, although I wasn't as a leader, that's why some call it G4, G5, whatever. First, after we had the electoral pact, we didn't have a political strategy. Because let me talk about what's happened in 5 years. 2016, we began the assembly. We didn't have the pact, and we changed the game. The person that took the most votes didn't lead everything. We started to disbelieve each other. And why we didn't believe in each other? 2016, the 3 first months, partying and everything. And April came, some wanted to be the amnesty. 2016, we sat down with the Pope, some prisoners were released, and that was basically it. 2017, we had the constitutional rupture, the public ministry said, then TCJ, then the assembly protest for 120 days. A bunch of people were killed. And from there, we end 2017, we ended by saying, we're not gonna accept the Constitution. Some protested on the street with the citizens, genuinely. Others were creating in hours only. The strategy inside the opposition was changed. And we've won some governor's offices and the others. I mean, in the past 5 years, because in 2019, when Guaidó was overwhelmingly powerful, we did not have that strategic alignment in either of those 5 years. And this year, we have this global pandemic. But let me end by saying this. We have to understand those that don't agree with us, and understanding Vladimir and Vanessa. And I cannot say Vladimir is terrible and Vanessa loves British people. And I've spoken with Vladimir. No, Gaby is dumb. I mean, we never begin by listening to Vladimir's proposal. I've heard him in the media, but the idea when I finished the interview and Gorin, I was told, did Gorin pay you to be in Vladimir's program? And I said to myself, I mean, I'm sorry, the gossip of wasting time looking at each other's mistakes and errors is terrible. I mean, we planned a bunch of ideas. The idea from Thursday to Sunday, then Sunday to Tuesday, while the regime plans for 6 months, 10 months ahead. In the opposition, we don't have a it makes me laugh. It says that you are in I was in February 23 in Cucuta, in that Humanitarian Aid terrible day. And when I moved with Varela, I saw the people say, you got to go back to Colombia, you're going to get killed. So how can I believe that I see people that without being armed, I can go against a bunch of military guys. I mean, I lived it again. But I was told, look, there's a plan to kill you, go back to Colombia. And I saw a person running towards me and say, hey, you're gonna get killed, leave. So we cannot be underestimating each other so much, undermining and saying that we're all dumb and everything. We have to advance to move on and really build a coalition, including all of the sectors of the country, and in which I think that the international community does have an important role here. I know how to do policy. That's what I like. I've never been in a table that the plan is to invade Venezuela. Sometimes I've wondered if that would be a solution. But I know we have to negotiate so that there aren't deaths. We already have deaths. We already have violence. Since if we do not look at the map and the big picture, we're not going to be able to understand all the internal and external problems of the country. Gaby, I mentioned you and Ricardo today. I want you to be the leaders of the big vacuum, and I want you to sit down and talk about topics or ideas that lead to the convergence of two or three things. What could be done? Ideas, politics, steps. I mean, do you have any idea on something that you could both agree on? I'd like to ask that to both Gaby and Ricardo. I think that we do have, without knowing Ricardo, I think Ricardo disagrees that I think that Ricardo agrees with me that illegal forces have taken over the country. The idea is that we want separation of powers and institutions, and we want to seek democracy. So what joins us? What's our common ground? Individually, if I would take positions within the opposition, I would do three things. If it's in my hands, I would do three things. One, I would debate with those that don't agree with me. The opposition really is, I mean, not the opposition, the leaders of the opposition. It's like a room full of mirrors. They only speak to each other. I would look for those that think entirely different to me in the opposition. Second, I would try to find the common grounds. Vanessa touched something. We want to judge Maduro, or do we want him to leave? I mean, those are questions that in the democratic sectors, nobody's asking. And I think that with Ricardo, we can discuss that. I think that both of us want our brothers do not have to go and escape from Venezuela. I mean, I think that Ricardo wants the military to not be corrupt. We want public ministries. We want free and autonomous media. We want to respect each other. That's our common ground for sure. Let me stop it there. There are other things that separate us, of course. Let me say something quickly. Yes, and then we have Ricardo, and the last word is given to Vladimir. So Vanessa, there's a concept. I was a professor of philosophy, of political philosophy, and there's a concept of capacity of conversation. In a democracy that works, you should sit with different sectors and not sell your soul or pact on something that you don't believe, but really sit, listen to the reasoning of the other side, and to try to appeal to their reason and emotion, say, okay, how you see it is interesting, but let me tell you how I see it, and see what values, what we have in common to reach a consensus of how to move on. And what are the spaces in which we can join forces and those in which we can have differences? That's basic for a democracy. I entirely agree with what Gaby said, who I love and respected for many years, on that being lost. And using Twitter it really excludes everybody. No, you cannot appear like Vladimir. Why not? Why can't he interview you? And that value, yeah. But Vanessa, Vladimir is a nice guy. He's a gentleman, right? Right, Vladimir? Yeah, he's our panelist. We've got to defend him. Yeah, I understand your point. Yes, of course. Ricardo, you've been sitting there. For instance, let's say you're sitting with Gaby. First, there are common grounds with her, yes. But let me state to all of you some premises or guidelines that I think we should use that relate to those common grounds that we have politically to be able to develop a discussion, a sane discussion. For instance, when we said, okay, what will we do in the National Assembly? We would propose the need of developing all of the procedures necessary to reinstitutionalize the country. We spoke of the need of changing public powers, of seeking the balance of the public powers, which today are in the hands of the political oligarchy. Also, we spoke of the need of defending our sovereign integrity. Of course, I'm not saying that the international community does not play an important role. It should be with us for cooperation purposes and not as it has been recently. And another important point is that we should take all the paths necessary facing whatever adversity. We have to go through the electoral route. It's important as well to create future agreements. So those are the 4 elements. I'm not saying nothing new. Today, we have been balancing. So what's the process of this? We are trying to find a balance to build an alternative for the country, developed because we go against the elite of the leaders that we have. So what's the first thing that pops into my mind? When it comes to international relations, why don't we speak with the countries? And there are countries that are intoxicated with the opposition. I mean, we should have an international conference about Venezuela. And we should discuss 3 main things in that conference. The democratic transition, so that everybody understands. Because if we tell the people, if we don't tell the world what we want in the transition, we cannot, is it going to be that Maduro that's going to go and live in southern France? Or what? I mean, we need to, there are enough forces that would help us look at these this elite and the economic situation of Venezuela. How would international relations contribute to help us recover the nation's assets? How will these assets be used? Or what about the international cooperation agreements, like the International Monetary Fund? So we would look at how we can develop that. And the third item is humanitarian aid. Not like what happened in Cucuta. No, that was part of a political agenda, which unfortunately a lot of people followed and considered that they were mistaken. But I would create the international conference. And you have to even include the governments. If we sit with Canada or European countries, we really need everybody's voice here because, as Gaby said before, we have a government that has its own support. The other thing that I would also propose is to make a national conference to discuss a program and a strategic line. Okay, what's the strategic agreement that we want? I mean, what are the short-term goals and medium-term goals that we have? First, we need to have a program of the country that should be, it should not be only by an elite group of people. It should be a national debate. And with that program, we should start to build socially and related to the national network. I mean, if we do not have social foundations throughout the country, we have to start rebuilding them. One thing is that Gaby and the groups that support her can talk through the radio and everything, but we have another organized group. We have to include different social movements in the country that can fall in love with the program for the country to get out of this crisis. So a national debate would also be great. And also on a short-term basis, we have elections, municipal and regional elections soon. Are we going to let the elite all again take over the municipalities? That's something else that we have to talk about. Will we assist? Will we have enough forces to confront the presidential elections? And what else? On a short-term basis. Right now, we have an assembly that will begin on January 5th. We all have expectations. We'll see the first debates of that assembly, but when we talk about the electoral route, we talk not only about the elections, regional and municipal, but also we consider the importance of discussing major issues with the people of Venezuela. And this is a proposal that we had. Why don't we agree? I'm proposing to Venezuela a constructive referendum. Or why don't we get involved in the battle for a referendum for the mandate of the president? I mean, there are possible paths that we can take to reach agreements and to build a social force that's sound, that allow us to get out of this mess. Let me stop here. Something else. We're not going to propose to the country for a national agreement in terms of economics or social. Will that be discussed by the National Assembly alone? I mean, whatever the elite will say, is that enough? I mean, I just want, I'm thinking out loud here. Who can really lead that national conference, that national meeting? Those that have big and small support. I think that we need diversity. We have to understand that diversity should be respected. Who's going to invite everybody? Who's going to lead this? You cannot say that if I have more votes, I can impose my viewpoints. I mean, we have to look at topics that will lead to common grounds. Something else that's important that we should discuss in these agreements, and that was part of the recommendations given by Ken. We have to open a discussion on the militaries. When we proposed our program for the National Assembly, we said that we need to have more control over our military, see their budget, their policies, where the money goes for the defense. We have to limit the militarization of the country because the militaries are controlled also by just an elite. And this implies that we have to have a lot of dialogue to tell the military that that we're not going to kill them after Maduro leaves. And something else that's important that has to do with the transitional justice. Certainly, there are cases that need justice. Those that have committed crimes have to pay for them, of course. We've got to have that transition. I'm talking about everybody that has committed a crime in the country. So I assume that these are fundamental aspects that we should discuss and that lead to more possibilities so we can find a way out for the country that's democratic and that helps us recover the constitutionality of the country. That's a lot. Look, we're going on and on, but Vladimir, would you like to close? Mute. I would like to thank the panelists, the Vanessa, Gaby, Ken, and Ricardo, my friend. But I agree with what you've said, but there are things that I don't agree with. I like the idea of creating a conference about Venezuela. But first, we need a conference among Venezuelans. We cannot say that if the opposition solves its problems, the country solves its problems. I mean, looking at this colloquially, in a family, the conflict has to begin because there are parties in the family that say, okay, we've got a problem, we've got to solve it. In this case, I really respect everything that has been said, from the most conservative and the most extreme. I've got my own. And mine is aimed towards something else. If we do not, the idea is that we have to talk, avoid violence. The world is full of examples of things that are worse. We cannot say that Venezuela is the worst of worst. There are parts of the world that are even worse than Venezuela. The idea is not to squash the other party, squash Maduro. We've got Colombia and other examples. With regards that the only negotiation is if Maduro is going to go to southern France or not. That's not a chance. In Venezuela, we say, if you want to wish it, it doesn't make it come true. I mean, wishes are not enough because with wishes, look at all the mistakes have been made based on those wishes. So we need political realism because Maduro's not him alone. He's a political sector that supports him. There's a party. It's got most of the militaries back him up as well. And also a popular sector, small, but see him as a beacon because anything that you see in Venezuela has to be related to symbols. Look, today, more than 50% of the Venezuelans say that they prefer Chavez over Guaidó. There's a big conglomerate of Venezuela that think that Chavism is the best leader, and they still remember him fondly. So the idea is to take Maduro out of the country would be a solution. It's not good. That will deepen the conflict in Venezuela. it's not that it's not related to justice, and we need a transitional justice system. Yes. Well, I believe that you have to pay for your crimes. Yes. I have reported the fight in every program I made. Everybody that's against human rights is terrible, but to close. I think that what's important is to understand. Look, there are many visions and that we've seen in practice, strategies, again, that have failed. For instance, what happened in 2014? What for? What happened April 30th, 2019? What took place after that? And all these events that have strengthened the government, the drones, we don't know who was behind that. Those type of adventures really strengthen Maduro. So we need a setting in which everybody discusses, either in Venezuela or outside. Because surely there's a lot of people that can't come to the country. I've seen, for instance, how Leopoldo López began by saying really bad things, and now he's softer. Here we've seen the opposition saying that we need international players involved in what we're doing. I don't want Cubans or Russians or British people or Peruvians, Canadians deciding for us. We've got to make our own decisions. But we need a good opposition to at least respect each other. If you want weapons, move them, but don't involve me. If you believe in elections, okay, push for that. But you cannot just continue being intellectually inferior. I mean, just because you're paid by an entity doesn't make it possible. So I go back to what Ricardo said. We need a conference, a national conference, yes. And the institutional role. I, I think that Almagro really was wrong in his strategy. The way he led the topic, of course, this is something that we have to debate on. And also, I believe that the Lima group has not helped at all. And I also question the tone of those that participated in the last election, the tone that was very soft against Maduro and his government. But I also know that the opposition did not participate in 2018 elections because they didn't want a candidate. So we need coherence to recover the electoral route. And we need to face the government, and we've got to speak loudly for what we want. We don't want violence. We want popular mobilization by rescuing and recovering our electoral route. The idea is to hear everybody's viewpoint and understand maybe others are right. We cannot always say that there are only two viewpoints in any discussion. Mine and everybody else's that's wrong. No. Let's look at the towards the front, towards the future. Let's stop always stumbling at our mistakes. Here I stop, Ken. Thank you so much for your invitation, and thank you, Vanessa, Gaby, and Ricardo Rojas for being with me. Thank you, Vladimir, Vanessa, Gaby, and Ricardo. There's a lot to think about. This won't be our first time that we'll be discussing Venezuela. I hope this is a stepping stone, the beginning of more discussions, more webinars of people that fill in a gap in that vacuum. I would like to close this webinar. Those that want to watch the video of this webinar, it will be available as of tomorrow, both in English and in Spanish, at cca.canada.com. So for now, and until January 12th, when we come back for the annual the Economic and Political Forecast Seminar, I wish you all a great and Merry Christmas, a great 2021. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.